and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Trump and Kim Jong-un have continued to threaten unleashing the nuclear option. How can countries neighboring the DPRK like China, South Korea, and Japan ensure that the U.S. and DPRK's war of words does not escalate into a war of bombs? And President Trump's nationalistic populism and disdain towards the EU have forced Europe to no longer take U.S. support for granted. Has Trump inadvertently defined the values that Europe stands for? And we begin today's program with the escalating tensions in Northeast Asia. DPRK's recent series of missile tests prompting South Korea to beef up its military muscle. What's more, the war of words between Washington and Pyongyang have also raised the fears of a sudden clash. Japan has decided to deploy missile interceptors along the possible path of DPRK ballistic missiles to be fired towards Guam. Chinese President Xi Jinping urged the restraint of all sides when talking with U.S. President Donald Trump on the phone. So how will all these affect the security in Northeast Asia, and how to make everyone calm down? Before we go to our panel, let's take a look.
Attention is rising in Northeast Asia. Kim Jong-un, the top leader of the DPRK, on Monday praised his army's plans to fire missiles towards the US territory of Guam in the Pacific, but said he would hold off on the launch. Kim was referring to the announcement on August the 10th by the DPRK to warn the US of a preemptive strike over Japan and into waters off Guam through 4 intermediate-range ballistic missiles in response to the US President Donald Trump's threat on August the 8th to hit the DPRK with fire and fury.
The Korean People's Army Strategic Force is now carefully examining operational plans to envelop Guam with fire, using the medium to long-range strategic ballistic rocket Hwasong-12.
However, it received an immediate response by US President Donald Trump, who tweeted that military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded, should North Korea act unwisely. Hopefully Kim Jong-un will find another path.
I think what the president was just reaffirming is the United States has the capability to fully defend itself from any attack and defend our allies, and we will do so. And so the American people should sleep well at night.
Given the escalating tensions, China has urged restraint from all sides.
President Xi stressed that China and the U.S. have common interests in reaching the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and safeguarding its peace and stability. All concerned parties need to maintain restraint and avoid any words or actions that could further escalate tensions.
Also, Moon Jae-in, the ROK's leader, waded in, saying there will be no military action on the Korean Peninsula without Seoul's consent, and that the government would prevent war in any way possible. The tensions on the Korean Peninsula have reached an unprecedented level. How the DPRK and the US will behave next is the focus of the situation in Northeast Asia.
So how are the odds stacked against Northeast Asian security? Let's ask our panelist, Yang Xiyu, with us, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Joining us in Seoul, South Korea, Jinjang Lim, who is an assistant professor at the College of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University. And also joining us in Washington, D.C., we invited Jonathan Pollack, Senior Fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the three of you. Today we are focusing on what is likely to be the impact of the rhetoric war going on between Washington and Pyongyang. Let's go to you, Ms. Lim. What does this mean for South Korea? Is South Korea getting ever more safer, or South Korea is actually ever more dangerous, even though Pyongyang and Washington began to fight verbally?
South Korean public, we have been pretty much familiar with all this series of provocative wording from Pyongyang. So this is not actually our first time, to listen to this kind of very stimulating wording from the Pyongyang. But probably this might be remembered as our first time to listen to this kind of stimulating word, another like exchange of stimulating words between the Pyongyang and Washington now. But so far, it looks like, again, the Seoul looks pretty much stable, or people are trying to be more like, how would you say, stable intentionally, because we do remember 20 years ago in the 1994 when the first nuclear crisis did occur. You know, most of us really did panic, but we learned something, I think, from that historic moment. So it looks like now we are trying to be more rational as of now.
But Mr. Pollack, will the U.S., that's a big question mark, if North Korea under threat to the extent that they think the real danger is there, they might not strike the United States, even though they threaten to. They might just strike their neighbors, as they earlier claimed as well. So does South Korea and also probably Japan face the danger?
I think, frankly, South Korea and Japan face the potential dangers much more than the United States. I think, although there is understandable concern in many places in the United States about the possibility that North Korea will ultimately possess an operational nuclear weapon that can reach the United States, the real dangers right now are on the peninsula and in the immediate region, not against the United States. I don't want to call the exchange of threats between the U.S. and North Korea just to be a game, but the realities are that the dangers are very physically concentrated in Northeast Asia, and that needs to be the real focus of concern, in my view. And I think that frankly should be the real focus of concern of American policymakers.
So is China concerned if its own security is being threatened as a result of these rhetorical words, at this stage at least?
Well, actually, China's national security has been threatening more and more seriously with the escalation of the danger of war on the peninsula, although I firmly believe the war is not immediate at all. The problem or the danger is the escalation of the further test will trigger the escalation of military preparedness and the political consultations between Washington and Seoul. Now, fortunately, Seoul and Washington haven't reached the consensus about the military action. If the situation reaches that point, that would be a real danger of war, and the spillover of the war effect will certainly damage all of the surrounding nations, including China.
Can China do anything to avoid a possible war, even possible military conflict based on unreasonable analysis of the reality?
Unfortunately, there's no any effective way for China or tool or leverage in China's hand to prevent the war from happening. I mean, the war either between the two Koreas or the war between North Korea and U.S. participated by the South Korea. No leverage. However, the only way for China available is to bring about the negotiation solution, negotiated solution, peaceful solution to the nuclear issue, to defuse the danger.
Having said that, then let me just read a quote coming from the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi. He said this after the UN Security Council reached a resolution further doing economic sanctions against the DPRK. Foreign Minister Wang from China, Mr. Wang Yi, said, "We are entering a critical phase on the situation in the Korean Peninsula after the resolution is passed." So, Ms. Lim, with the UN Security Council resolution, we know it's not the ultimate solution. We all know that. We're not naive, right? But is it going to be a window opportunity considered by all parties? Or is it going to be wasted by parties involved as a window toward the future further and bigger tensions?
Yes, of course. To some degree, I share a kind of critical observation with people who are really critical or pessimistic about the effectiveness of sanctions. But still, the meaning of this collective action I don't think it is meaningless because, again, from the history, what you learn is, again, the North Korea was always, trying to play with its different cards. So whenever we show some gaps actually between us, if so, it can be a good opportunity for them actually to manipulate those gaps. So in that sense, I do see this kind of collective action of the international society is really meaningful because we really need to show that, that we do have a strong collective will, which is, again, against their nuclear armament.
Mr. Polak, what about for you? For your analysis of what has followed after UN Security Council resolution, remember President Trump was claiming it as a big victory. Okay, a big victory for what? A big victory for next steps to be taken in order to prevent further crisis. But have we seen those steps?
Well, President Trump is often a very, very impatient individual. He seems to expect instant results and the like. And if those of us, like all the people on this show, know very, very well, that these are very protracted issues. They don't admit to easy solution. But I would agree very much with Professor Lin that we, by creating a unified position, at least on paper, and uniform obligations that all those who signed the latest Security Council resolution have, we can, over a longer period of time, not immediately, really affect how North Korea approaches its interests and what it does. I don't think that any of us have effective control over North Korea. I think one of the biggest misconceptions among American thinkers, some American officials, is that somehow China has the hidden key to this. That's not my reading of the situation, but the last thing any of us should want is to find us in a situation of inadvertent or undesirable conflict. War avoidance has to be the utmost priority.
Washington elites take President Trump as a target for failing to come up with policies even regarding North Korea. But we have to ask, what have the apparatus, the machines in Washington come up with when it comes to solutions to deal with North Korea? It's not just President Trump's voice. There's also Secretary of State. There's also the Defense Secretary. There's also the Congress. There's also think tanks in Washington. So what have you come up with? Can you all blame President Trump for where the current situation is? Can you all blame President Trump as an individual for lack of plan coming from the United States? Can U.S. states put itself together to somewhat degree, come up with something, do something?
Well, first things first, I'm not going to blame President Trump for this situation that has emerged over a very long period of time. I am, however, holding him accountable for the words that he uses now, which could needlessly trigger worries, concerns that we could be closer to war. Now, again, I agree very much with Yang Xiyu that I do not believe we are on the edge of a conflict, but it's very important to not to make what is a very, very difficult situation that much worse. At the end of the day, I would acknowledge, and I would agree with you, that to talk about a solution here really presumes that there is a compatibility in goals between, let's just say, the United States and North Korea. And that clearly does not exist in any way, shape, or form. But what the United States does share with other powers, including China, is a belief that there can never be an acceptance of the legitimacy of the North Koreans pursuing a nuclear weapons capability.
So what's next, Mr. Yang? What's next? It's already quite clear to us, some facts at least. Before North Korea does anything, we are already seeing ever more divide among the countries in Northeast Asia. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, actually, now the key words is how. We have a complex of differences and contradictions, not only between U.S. and North Korea, among every party between. And the key word is how. and how the international community, for example, how the 5 countries in the CGTN talks to act coordinately or cooperatively or differently. That will lead to different direction. I think that is the core meaning of the window of X. Window of opportunity you mentioned, or window of new round of conflicts leading to uncontrollable war. So for the ideal result, we hope we need to have a coordinated and cooperative actions, at least among the 5, based on several fundamental consensus. For example, number 1, what is the key words of the solution of the complex nuclear issue? Maybe American friends say, very simple, denuclearize North Korea, that's it. But for China's way, maybe a little bit complex, say, besides denuclearize North Korea, we want to bring about the denuclearization of the whole peninsula, and as well completely, fairly address North Korea's legitimate concerns in diplomacy and security and economy.
That's what China say, freeze for freeze proposal.
Oh yes, and we have made a consensus in the 19 Jong statement, say commitment to commitment and action to action, addressing fairly the concerns.
Professor Lim, what do you think about the Chinese proposal? Can the South Koreans come ever closer to that proposal? Will South Korea be able to convince the United States to come closer to that proposal?
THAAD deployment, absolutely, it has been controversial, or even that kind of joint exercise. Some more like a radical people have been like a negative or pessimistic about, critical about that too. But our general understandings about the THAAD and about our joint exercise with the United States is our legal right, I mean, for our defense. It's not, again, offense against North Korea. That's our, again, the general understanding. And it's only for our defense purposes. So in that sense, I mean, it's, you said like a freeze for freeze or that kind of, more like equivalent exchange between the two. But generally, again, Korean public don't think the THAAD issue is that equivalently, correspondingly provocative or offensive against the North, like their nuclear that kind of ambition.
Mr. Yang, perception very different. Very quickly to respond from your South Korean counterpart. Mr. Yang.
Well, I think THAAD issue, nuclear issue, and nuclear and ICBM issue on the peninsula, for China's point of view, a complex issue. We cannot separate all of the stuff, items from each other. And the problem is, in China's view, during the past 2 decades, both North and South Korea are engaging the arms race by addition with addition, adding North Korea's military capabilities and adding South Korean military. And as a result, our host Tianwei mentioned, are we safer than before? North Korea and South Korea are safer than before? Absolutely no. And as well, you are unsafer than before, and we are unsafer than before either, because of the complex escalation of the tensions on the peninsula. So we need to change our mindset, and we to re-explore the new way towards the peaceful solution.
I'm having a long sigh as well before we wrap it up, but I want to have one very simple sentence from every one of you. What would this mean for our Northeast Asia? One sentence and one sentence only, briefly. Professor Jong Lim.
Again, I can agree more with Mr. Yang and with Mr. Polak. Again, here we refers to 5 party, minus again the North Korea out of the 6. So this at least 3. If it is impossible to get a kind of consensus among 5, at least 3, China, U.S. and South Korea, we have to get a consensus before actually we move on to another action.
One sentence. Okay, Jonathan Polak, your turn.
The deeper issue here, in my view, is not only the immediate nuclear issue, but the very character of the North Korean political system and the fact that, unlike all of its neighbors, it is not interested in genuine engagement, genuine economic advancement, and normal relations with others.
Last but not least, Mr. Yang Xiyu.
It's high time for the five parties to rethink about the cooperation and the coordination on this complex issue. If freeze for freeze is not good, please offer a better replacement.
Mr. Zhang Lin, Mr. Johnson Polak, Mr. Yang Xiyu, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN. Still to come on our program. Trump's disdain towards the EU has forced Europe to no longer take U.S. support for granted. Has Trump's unpopularity in Europe affected the prospects of other populist candidates getting elected there? We're going to ask those questions when we come back. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Since Trump took office, the traditional U.S.-EU alliance has been tested, to say the least. In a recent poll, not surprisingly, Trump is personally unpopular across Europe, but some say this unpopularity, more anti-Trump than anti-American, has helped to reinforce European values. Will that truly become an opportunity? How will that alter political trends in Europe? Before we go to our panel, this background story first.
100 years after the entry of American forces into World War I, the transatlantic bond between the United States and Europe is as strong as ever, and maybe in many ways even stronger.
Beautiful words followed by concerns on possible deeds.
President Trump said yesterday and also that words are easy, but it is actions that matter.
Europe's lack of confidence in Trump is not without reason. The unpredictable leader once slammed NATO, but soon changed his tone.
I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete. It's my hope that NATO will take on an increased role in supporting our Iraqi partners in their battle against ISIS.
Not surprisingly, Trump is personally unpopular across Europe. A recent Pew poll indicates that only 22% of Britons, 14% of French, and 11% of Germans have confidence in him. Among European leaders, disappointments also remain, especially after Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the global agreement to combat climate change.
I have a strong disagreement with President Trump. It is known. I've had exchanges with him over it. We share it with Chancellor Merkel. It is on climate.
But this very unpopularity, more anti-Trump than anti-American, has helped to reinforce European values. Or as some optimists believe, in every difficulty there is always new opportunity. What could these look like?
Is U.S. President Donald Trump's attitude toward Europe a challenge or an opportunity? That's really a question. Joining us in the Beijing studio, strong panel, Ian Beck, who is a professorial research fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and also an associate fellow at the Chatham House. What a pleasure, sir, to see you here in the Beijing studio.
And for me to be here.
Great to have you. And of course, we want to extend our welcome as well to Einar Tangen, who's an economic and political affairs commentator. It's great to have you, sir, as well. Let's begin by talking about a joke people these days are telling, whether U.S. is from Mars and Europe is from Venus. Mr. Beck, I guess you have your interpretations.
Well, that's one metaphor we could use because things are looking very different on the different sides of the Atlantic. But it's also very striking that some are now referring to Emmanuel Macron, the new French president, as Jupiter. So he's an even bigger planet than Venus or Mars.
Things are getting ever more complicated.
Indeed, yes.
But exactly what is your answer? Is U.S. and Europe going so divergent in different ways?
I think we can exaggerate this. And one of the sayings about Donald Trump is that the most influential person in his background is the person he last spoke to. He seems to change his mind all the time on some of the big questions. And this makes it very difficult for Europeans to read what the US wants as opposed to what Trump wants. And the fact that we now see what are known as the grown-ups, the three generals, apparently in charge of US policy, is very reassuring for Europeans.
Is it reassuring to the Americans? And what about the future that the Europe and America's togetherness, in a way, is uncertain?
Well, I think you have to look at the background, at the long-term trends. Stop concentrating on the symptoms, which I think Donald Trump represents, and start looking at the trends that are going there.
What are the trends?
Well, the fact are, the U.S. and Europe are competitors. If you want to draw somebody, it is not China, it is not Russia. They might compete on a political level, but on an economic level, we make everything that the Europeans make, and vice versa. So we are head-to-head competition in many ways, whether it's medical or airplanes or whatever. So big ticket items are a big issue. And there are real signs that things are going. This America First idea does not have any room for the kind of collegial relationships that was before. TTIP is now dead, all right? The Asia Accord, dead, all right? Real questions about how less warm the welcome was when he came to NATO and decided not to reaffirm Article 5 until, a couple of weeks later. Very, very strained.
I think we're talking about two very different layers of things. One is the ideology. The other is the platforms. Sometimes the platforms, when they are putting together, do represent, to a certain extent, the ideologies that both sides are looking at. Climate change you talk about. You ought to talk about the future of the NATO, the United Nations. All of these seems to be Europeans holding on to, and yet the Americans are moving a bit farther away from. So, Mr. Pegg, do you think the Europeans, though, can stand on its own feet?
Oh yes, Europe is a...
Well, coming from Europe, you would definitely say so, but is it really?
Yes, but there's good reason to believe it. In fact, as economies, the US and the European economy are pretty closed. They trade within themselves much more than they trade between each other. And that is something that's very important to recognize. And I'd also disagree with Einar in one important respect, which is that although Trump has articulated an ideological agenda, such as climate change, such as America First, and all of that, beneath the surface, American business is saying, wait a minute, we don't want to go in this direction. The American political system is saying, we'll still go ahead with climate mitigation policies, even though Trump is trying to deny COP21. So I don't think it's as simple as saying there's a division and a competition. There's a lot of common ground still.
But we have debated about this for a long time, Mr. Beck and Mr. Tang, including with the two of you, that when the federal government is determined, particularly the White House, going one direction, can the state administrations and also individual businesses going the other? That's a big question mark, Mr. Beck. Are you trying to look at the sunny part of the things, trying to ignore the realities?
Well, I think that Trump is finding in power that he has far less power than he imagined, because there are so many checks and balances, and the state level in the US remains extremely important.
The Europeans should be happy, because if the Americans are not going in the direction of doing more environmentally friendly, let's just say industries, technologies, and research innovations, the Europeans are going to grasp a market as easy as possible.
Yes, well, they'll be competing with China.
I see some smile on your face.
They'll be competing with China when they do that, because China is now the major producer of the wind turbines.
All right,
well,
Mr. Hangen.
Okay, and I understand what you're saying, but the polls have come out and they've said that over 70% of Americans think that the current Congress is doing a bad job. You have tremendous dissatisfaction. You have tremendous amounts of anger that are being things. People feel left behind. 2008, 2009 left. What happened? People got nothing. And the investment bankers and everything went back to normal.
So what are you trying to say, Mr. Kang?
So what I'm saying is that there is very, very deep dissatisfaction within the United States. The fact that Trump can act the way he does and still get a solid 32, 36% of the people, including those who backed him in the first place, is a real indication that these are going to continue to be very important parts of the political strategy.
Mr. Beck, what Mr. Kangan is trying to suggest is don't be too optimistic, because many Americans really think alike with President Trump, at least on certain issues.
Yes, but I would still insist on the fact that there are countervailing forces which are dampening the enthusiasm that Trump started with and making it very difficult for him to pursue the agenda, even if there is that remaining support for him.
But you got its populist versus this kind of business or elitist agenda clash that's going on. And you have that the same, Brexit is exactly the same. It was in fact run by the same Cambridge Analytica that was so successful that one moved to the other.
Talking about the Brexit, it seems that President Trump was quite pleasant about that choice made by the UK, your home country, Mr. Berger. And he was asking even Theresa May, when they were meeting with one another a month ago, who's next? We all remember that beautiful quote, in a way. But having said that, though, what about the trend going on in the United States in that direction, so-called America First, and also the one that is going on in Europe, particularly the UK? You are having this very long process of negotiation Brexit. What is the current stage now? And what about the three layers of so-called the Brexit or the Europe's future that people have been talking about?
Well, the Brexit negotiations from a British point of view are not going well yet. There's one very telling picture where the European side arrived, and Michel Barnier and his two assistants, big dossiers in front of them, and the British side were on the other side of the table, David Davis, the lead negotiator, with nothing in front of him. That told you, it may be symbolic, but it told you that the British position is not yet clear. The British political system is not clear what it wants from Brexit. And as it pushes it further, there's a lot of backlash coming in. Many people saying, well, are you sure you want this? And hence this debate now between hard and soft Brexit, which seemed to be settled 6 months ago, is now open again.
But people are already talking about a post-Brexit era in Europe. People give this kind of scenarios. Where is Europe going to? They talk about, well, probably there's a Europe that's focusing on the custom union. There's a possibility also a Europe that's focusing on the euro itself. Or there's another possibility of Europe which focusing on the Schengen agreement. So these are very different layers of togetherness in a way that we're talking about. Mr. Beck, what is your judgment? Where do you think is the easy target for all sides to reach and get the paper stacked up in front of David Davis?
I think the answer is that they overlap. I mean, there are more countries in Schengen who are already not members of the European Union, such as Norway and Switzerland. There are European countries which are in NATO, like Turkey, but not in the European Union. So you have to look at the overlaps and not see it as a limited, slightly more expanded, and a larger one. There's a range of overlapping things which are characterize the way Europe is evolving. Now, where this is taking us to next is uncertain. The European Commission produced what it called its white paper on the future of Europe, in which it tried to set out scenarios. It did not offer a judgment on which one to go for. My guess is that they will not limit themselves to the customs union or the single market. It will be something bigger, but we don't yet know the contours of it.
Will Donald Trump be eventually, when you look at things, Mr. Beck, in retrospect, let's just say a few hundred years or a few decades from now, a gift to the Europeans? I mean, it gives you an opportunity to think about your relationship with the biggest power in the world. It gives you an opportunity to think about what about the system within yourself, how it can be better. And it gives even an opportunity to think about whether you need to have a more coordinated defense system on your own rather than depending on the Americans as the ally. What about all of these opportunities, quote unquote?
Well, I think you're exactly right, that there is an impetus now towards change in Europe, which is partly emanating from what Trump has been saying, his vacillation over whether he supports NATO. The fact that some European countries find it very difficult to spend the money on defence. There's a huge amount of troops, there's a huge amount of expenditure, but it's not very well coordinated. Trump is, to some extent, the catalyst for changing that. He's less a catalyst for changing the economic model, I think, that where there is undoubtedly competition between the United States and European countries, but there's also a lot of complementarity.
That's right.
The same companies operating in both countries, the supply chains and the networks, they're an important feature of the. So it's not what I win, you lose. It's we can both win, we can both lose.
This is an interesting picture that I see, the Europe or the Europeans, if we could once again use that general term, are facing. On the one hand, there's uncertainty with the old allied kinds of relationship with the United States. On the other hand, you do also get a good partner, China. For example, about economics, about trade, about market. But there are some differences as well. We don't want to mention every one of them one by one. So it seems that you could not have a soulmate anymore, Europe, in a way, these days, rather standing alone in our world.
Yes, but I think this is where you need to break up Europe a bit and say there's antagonism between Donald Trump and Angela Merkel. But Trump and Macron seem to be the new best buddies.
On camera or in realities?
It's even been described as a bromance.
Yeah, they use
that's
that
the word
with
they
she
give.
also. Bromances are pretty short with Donald. He's had what, 3 divorces? Okay.
Right.
And 3 bromances.
Yeah.
Yes.
But without going into details about that, what exactly do you mean? Really? Is there going to be France bigger role in a way to have bigger relationship with the United States? What would that mean for France, Germany, in a way?
Well, France is clearly trying to reinvent itself under Macron, because what he's trying to do is to correct the French economic model, which has been weak over the last 20 years. The Germans are backing him in this, and as part of this, he's going to expect a new deal on the governance of the euro. Then he wants to play the security card and say, France is the strong country in Europe vis-a-vis the United States, so we want to be the bridge with the United States and some of that. Hence the invitation to the Bastille Day celebrations for Trump and so on. So there's a lot going on, and we don't really see yet where it's going to end.
Will the UK finally off the stage? It seems...
Well, I have to say this as a UK citizen, we're in a sad position. We don't know what we want from Brexit. We don't therefore know what our future role is in the world. And there are many even now drawing a parallel with what happened in the 1950s when Britain lost its empire, and saying this is a dangerous point in Britain's history.
Right. Mr. Tangen, when you look at the transatlantic relationship, at the end of the day, what will that be about?
Well, I mean, there will continue to be cultural ties that go back and forth. Obviously, there are business ties and things like that. These are multinationals, though. They don't necessarily have any kind of alliance to any one country. I mean, you go to Europe and you talk to KPMG, it's all about Europe, KPMG. If you go to America, it's the same way. Yes, they're related businesses, they're under the same umbrella, but people want the business. I think there's a tremendous amount of competition that's coming forward. We're going through massive changes with technology. The number of jobs is going to change. The type of jobs is going to change. I think it's important, as I've said before, that they develop partnerships that are complementary to their existing economic capabilities, and that, to a large extent, means China at this point. India could come along, but right now there's no market like China. It's mature, it has everything that you need to produce, it has needs at the high end that can be filled by both the US and Europe. And I would argue that if you're Boeing and Airbus or you're GE Medical or Siemens, yes, it is a zero-sum game in that until China develops its own things. So I think in the future it's going to be a three-way situation with China rising, trying to get over this middle income gap, and going up and trying to compete directly with both Europe and the US. But in the meantime, it's about partnerships.
But I think there are also some common problems that China and Europe need to confront, one of which is aging of the population. Now, you know, it's locked into the system because of the previous demographics, but also climate change. The Europeans are very much on the same page as China on climate change, and I still think that the US are going to come behind this, despite Trump.
May I say you sound quite optimistic, to say the least, but you know, you never know. Ian Beck, Einar Tangen, what a pleasure to have both of you gentlemen. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insights CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.